On the 10th of November 1985, a hunter entered Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, and discovered a metal 55-gallon drum near the site of a burned-down store. What appeared to be an abandoned container soon became the center of a homicide investigation. When authorities examined the drum, they found the bodies of an adult woman and a young girl inside. The victims had been wrapped in plastic and concealed within the container. Investigators processed the scene and began efforts to determine the identities of the woman and child. Autopsies later concluded that both victims had died from blunt force trauma. Despite extensive examination, little was immediately known about who they were or how they came to be left in the park. The case remained unresolved, and the victims remained unidentified. After the recovery of the remains, the woman and child were buried in an Allenstown cemetery. Their headstone reflected the lack of answers available at the time, identifying them only as an unknown woman and an unknown girl whose bodies had been found in Bear Brook State Park. The burial marked a temporary conclusion to the initial investigation, but questions surrounding the case persisted. Nearly 15 years later, on the 9th of May 2000, investigators made another significant discovery near the original location. A second metal 55-gallon drum was found containing the remains of two young girls. Authorities believe the four victims were connected and concluded that all four murders had likely occurred around the same period. Investigators were unable to explain why the second barrel had not been located during the original search in 1985, though they noted it had been outside the initial crime scene area. The discovery of the second drum transformed the investigation and established what became known as the Bear Brook murders for many years afterward. Forensic examination of the victims provided investigators with some of the earliest clues about who the four individuals may have been. The adult female, later identified as Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, was estimated to have been between 23 and 33 years old at the time of her death. She had curly or wavy brown hair and stood between 5 feet 2 inches and 5 feet 7 inches tall. Examiners also noted significant dental work, including multiple fillings and 3 extracted teeth, details that became important reference points during identification efforts. The oldest child, later identified as Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, was estimated to be between 5 and 11 years old. She had wavy light brown hair and distinctive dental characteristics, including a crooked front tooth and a gap between her upper teeth. Investigators also noted that she wore 2 earrings in each ear. Examination revealed evidence that she had suffered from pneumonia, adding another detail to her profile. These observations helped build a clearer picture of the child investigators were attempting to identify. The middle child, later identified as Rhea Rasmussen, was believed to be between 2 and 4 years old. She had brown hair, a noticeable overbite, and may have suffered from anemia. Years later, DNA testing established that Terry Petter Rasmussen was her biological father. This finding became one of the most significant developments in understanding the relationships among the victims and the broader investigation. The youngest child, later identified as Sarah Lynn McWaters, was estimated to be between 1 and 3 years old. She had blonde or light brown hair and a distinctive gap between her front teeth. As forensic techniques advanced, artists created facial reconstructions of all 4 victims. These reconstructions, combined with physical and dental examinations, provided investigators with valuable clues about their identities, family connections, and personal backgrounds. For many years, the identities of the Bear Brook victims remained unknown despite extensive investigative efforts. Authorities publicized the case throughout the United States and parts of Canada, hoping that someone would recognize the victims or provide information that could identify them. Investigators reviewed hundreds of leads and compared the victims against numerous missing person reports. During this process, at least 10 possible identities were examined and ultimately ruled out. Although the investigation remained active, no definitive identification emerged during these early years. As forensic technology improved, investigators sought new methods to generate public interest and produce additional leads. In 2013, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children developed updated facial reconstructions of the victims. These images incorporated detailed dental information, allowing artists to create more accurate representations of how the victims may have appeared during life. In 2015, another set of reconstructions was released. further refining the visual depictions available to investigators and the public. A major breakthrough arrived in 2014 through DNA profiling. Testing revealed that the adult woman, the oldest girl, and the youngest girl were maternally related. This finding established an important biological connection among 3 of the 4 victims and provided investigators with a clearer understanding of their relationships. Additional testing conducted in 2015 confirmed that the adult woman was the mother of the 2 girls. Investigators also relied on isotopic analysis to learn more about the victims' movements before their deaths. Results indicated that the woman and children had lived together in the northeastern United States during the period shortly before they were killed. The analysis also suggested that the middle child, who was not biologically related to the other 3 victims, may have originated from a different region of the country. Together, these forensic advances gradually transformed the investigation and moved the case closer to eventual identification and resolution. In 2017, investigators announced a significant development when they connected Terry Petter Rasmussen to the disappearance of Denise Beaudin in New Hampshire. This connection became an important step in understanding how Rasmussen might also be linked to the Bear Brook murders. Authorities began examining events surrounding Beaudin's disappearance and the man who had been living with her under the name Robert Bob Evans. Around Thanksgiving in 1981, Denise Beaudin disappeared along with her young daughter. At the time, she was living with Evans, a man whose true identity was unknown. Years later, investigators discovered that Evans was one of several aliases used by Rasmussen. The case gained additional attention because Beaudin's daughter later resurfaced under unusual circumstances. In 1986, the child, who became publicly known as Lisa, was abandoned at a campground in California. As investigators continued tracing connections between the various identities associated with Evans, DNA testing eventually established that Rasmussen was not Lisa's biological father. The investigation also revealed a broader pattern involving Rasmussen's criminal history and repeated use of aliases. Under another identity, he was convicted for the 2002 murder and dismemberment of his wife, Eunsoon Jun. As authorities reviewed records connected to multiple names and locations, they determined that Robert Evans was not a real identity, but another false persona adopted by Rasmussen. Rasmussen died in prison in 2010. However, his death did not end efforts to investigate his past. Authorities continued examining his movements, relationships, and criminal activities across several states. As more information emerged, investigators increasingly believed he was responsible for the Bear Brook murders as well as other crimes. What initially appeared to be separate disappearances and homicide investigations gradually became connected through Rasmussen's extensive use of aliases and his presence in multiple cases over many years. In 2017, investigators released video from a police interview with a man known as Robert Evans. The goal was simple: determine his true identity. For years, authorities had suspected that Evans was using an alias, but they lacked the evidence needed to identify him conclusively. The release of the interview footage generated renewed interest in the case and coincided with advances in genetic genealogy that would soon produce significant results. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter played a key role in narrowing down the suspect's background. Through genealogical research and DNA analysis, investigators were able to trace family connections that had previously remained hidden. Subsequent Y-DNA testing confirmed that the man known as Robert Evans was actually Terry Petter Rasmussen, a Colorado native born in 1943. This identification provided investigators with a verified name and a clearer understanding of the individual believed to be connected to the Bear Brook murders. Attention then turned toward identifying the victims. A major breakthrough came through the efforts of librarian and web sleuth Rebecca Heath. While researching possible identities, Heath discovered an online post created by Sarah McWater's younger half-brother, who had been searching for her since 1999. As she continued her research, Heath learned that Marlies Honeychurch had been involved with a man named Rasmussen. The connection immediately drew her attention because of the growing evidence surrounding Terry Petter Rasmussen and the Bear Brook case. Investigators reviewed the information and confirmed the relationship between the missing family and the unidentified victims. On the 6th of June 2019, authorities publicly identified Marlies Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, and Sarah McWaters as 3 of the Bear Brook victims. Investigators determined that Honeychurch and her daughters had disappeared from La Puente, California, around Thanksgiving 1978, while she was involved with Rasmussen. The case demonstrated how genetic genealogy and civilian research helped resolve long-standing questions and identify victims successfully. The final unidentified victim in the Bear Brook case remained a mystery for many years, even after the identities of the other victims had been established. Investigators had previously determined through DNA analysis that the middle child was the biological daughter of Terry Petter Rasmussen. They also identified her mother as Pepper Reed, a woman who disappeared during the 1970s. Although these discoveries narrowed the search considerably, the child's identity remained unknown for several more years. Additional DNA research continued to examine the child's maternal ancestry. Investigators traced family connections to relatives in Mississippi and used those findings to refine their understanding of her family background. Through continued genealogical analysis and forensic investigation, authorities were eventually able to establish her identity. In September 2025, New Hampshire officials announced that the child had been positively identified as Rhea Rasmussen, bringing resolution to the final unidentified victim connected to the case. The identifications also allowed surviving relatives to honor the victims properly. Following the public identification of Marlise Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, and Sarah McWaters in 2019, funerals and reburials were conducted. Honeychurch and Vaughn received a new headstone in Allenstown bearing their names. Sarah McWaters was laid to rest in Connecticut near her father's family. These ceremonies provided family members with an opportunity to recognize and remember loved ones whose identities had remained unknown for decades. The investigation also reinforced the significance of Terry Petter Rasmussen, often referred to as the chameleon killer. Known for using at least 5 aliases, he was believed to be connected to multiple homicides across the United States. The Bear Brook case ultimately demonstrated how persistent investigative work, advances in forensic science, and the growing use of genetic genealogy transformed one of New Hampshire's longest-running cold cases into a largely resolved investigation after decades of uncertainty and unanswered questions. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on the 18th of February, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons born to Thomas and Mary Ridgway. Accounts from relatives later described his childhood as troubled, with particular attention focused on his relationship with his mother. Family members characterized Mary Ridgway as a domineering parent who used corporal punishment for minor offenses. Years later, Ridgway told defense psychologists that he experienced conflicting emotions toward her, describing both anger and sexual attraction. He also reported fantasies about killing her during adolescence. These details became part of the documented background examined after his crimes were uncovered. Ridgway struggled academically during his school years. He was dyslexic, was held back for a year in high school, and had an IQ recorded in the low 80s. At the age of 16, he committed a violent act that later drew significant attention. He lured a 6-year-old boy into a wooded area and stabbed him. The child survived the attack. Although the incident did not define his public identity at the time, it became an important part of the record reviewed after his arrest. After graduating from Thai High School in 1969, Ridgway married his high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. He then joined the United States Navy and served during the Vietnam War aboard a supply ship. During his military service, he frequently visited prostitutes and contracted gonorrhea. His marriage eventually ended, and later relationships followed a similar pattern of instability. Friends and relatives often described him as friendly yet unusual, while former partners reported troubling behavior. During his adult years, Ridgway became intensely religious. He read the Bible aloud, promoted religious teachings, and expected strict adherence to those beliefs within his household. Former wives and girlfriends also described an unusually strong sexual appetite. Despite his religious practices, he continued seeking prostitutes and maintained a fixation on them. Ridgway later acknowledged having a complicated relationship with prostitutes, expressing both dependence on their services and resentment toward them. These documented aspects of Ridgway's life provide important context for understanding the period before the murders. His family background, behavioral history, relationships, religious practices, and attitudes toward women formed a record that investigators and psychologists later examined while attempting to understand the man who would become known as the Green River Killer. Together, these factors created a portrait of contradictions that remained significant throughout subsequent investigations and court proceedings. During the early 1980s, Gary Ridgway began committing the crimes that would later become known as the Green River Murders. His victims were primarily vulnerable women in the Seattle and Tacoma areas, including prostitutes and runaways. According to later admissions, he deliberately selected women whom he believed would be easier to approach and less likely to draw immediate attention if they disappeared. His crimes became concentrated during the period between 1982 and 1984, when numerous women vanished under similar circumstances. Ridgway developed methods for gaining the trust of potential victims before attacking them. He often approached women along Pacific Highway South and convinced them to enter his vehicle. In some cases, he showed photographs of his son, using them as a way to appear less threatening. After establishing a sense of trust, he would take the women to a location where he could isolate them. Sexual activity frequently preceded the murders. The killings were typically carried out through strangulation. Ridgway later described attacking victims from behind, using his arms to cut off their ability to resist. The murders occurred in various locations, including secluded areas, his vehicle, and his residence. Afterward, he disposed of the bodies in wooded and overgrown locations throughout King County. Many victims were left near the Green River, while others were found near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and additional dump sites across South King County. The first known victim connected to the series was discovered in July 1982. As additional bodies were found, investigators recognized emerging similarities involving the victims and the locations where they were abandoned. These connections led the King County Sheriff's Office to establish the Green River Task Force. Detectives began examining patterns in victim selection, body disposal, and the geographic concentration of discoveries in an effort to identify the offender responsible. Ridgway later admitted that he had a fixation on prostitutes and acknowledged targeting them because they were easier for him to approach. He also confessed that he sometimes returned to body disposal sites after the murders. Court records and interviews documented his admissions regarding necrophilia and his explanations for revisiting victims after death. According to his statements, these actions became part of his routine during portions of the killing period. By the mid-1980s, the number of victims and the wide distribution of remains had created one of the most challenging homicide investigations in the region. Detectives faced the difficult task of connecting cases spread across multiple locations while attempting to identify a killer who continued to avoid detection. The growing investigation reflected both the scale of the crimes and the obstacles confronting law enforcement during those early years. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Green River Task Force led a prolonged investigation into the series of murders attributed to the unidentified Green River Killer. It brought together investigators including Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, who coordinated extensive fieldwork and victim identification efforts across Washington state. In 1984, serial killer Ted Bundy provided unsolicited observations to investigators, offering insights that would later prove partially accurate in guiding aspects of the case. FBI profiler John Douglas also contributed behavioral analysis that helped shape investigative strategies during the ongoing search for the offender. The first significant link to Gary Ridgway emerged in 1983, following the disappearance of Marie Malvar, when witnesses reported a truck seen near his home. Multiple tips submitted to authorities also mentioned Ridgway, but investigators lacked sufficient physical evidence to justify an arrest at that time. Despite suspicion, Ridgway was interviewed by law enforcement, faced prostitution-related arrests, and successfully passed a polygraph examination in 1984. For years, forensic limitations restricted progress, as several pieces of evidence collected during the early investigation could not be fully analyzed at the time. Ridgway remained under suspicion for years while continuing to avoid prosecution, as investigators struggled to connect him definitively to the crimes. The Green River Task Force expanded its operations throughout the late 1980s, re-examining cold cases and re-interviewing witnesses in an effort to strengthen existing leads. Investigators repeatedly reviewed Ridgway's background and movements,
comparing his known activities with timelines of missing women reported in the region. Although circumstantial evidence continued to accumulate, legal standards of the time required more direct forensic confirmation before charges could be filed. During this period, investigators relied heavily on witness statements, vehicle descriptions, and inconsistent reports that made establishing a clear suspect profile difficult. Despite these challenges, the case remained active, with law enforcement continuing to pursue leads related to Ridgway and other potential suspects. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, advances in investigative techniques began to reshape how evidence from earlier years was reassessed. This renewed focus allowed investigators to revisit Ridgway's earlier interviews and compare inconsistencies with emerging forensic developments. However, without definitive biological evidence, prosecutors still could not proceed, leaving Ridgway free despite mounting suspicion. The investigation demonstrated how procedural delays and limited forensic technology allowed a long-term suspect to remain outside formal charges. Ridgway's continued evasion of arrest highlighted critical gaps in early serial murder investigations at the time. The development of this technology transformed earlier evidence that had once been inconclusive into powerful forensic material in the case investigation. Ridgway was married to Judith Mawson, who later provided statements describing unusual aspects of his behavior and their home environment. He also claimed that his killing activity decreased after their marriage, although investigators continued to evaluate his statements cautiously. On the 30th of November 2001, Ridgway was arrested while leaving the Kenworth truck factory where he worked as a spray painter. Authorities initially filed multiple murder charges as investigators moved quickly following the arrest. Forensic scientists linked microscopic paint particles found on victims to paint used at the factory where Ridgway worked. The evidence strengthened the connection between Ridgway and the crime scenes, reinforcing years of investigative findings. Years of investigative work combined with modern forensic science finally produced the evidence necessary for his arrest and prosecution. Investigators preserved the biological samples for years as laboratories gradually improved methods for extracting usable genetic profiles from degraded evidence. Weeks of comparison testing allowed analysts to confirm consistency between Ridgway's samples and evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes. The accumulation of forensic and testimonial evidence gradually strengthened the case as detectives revisited earlier investigative records. Each development in DNA science provided new opportunities to reinterpret evidence that had remained unresolved for decades. Ultimately, these scientific breakthroughs, aligned with long-term investigative persistence, to produce a decisive breakthrough in the case. The convergence of decades of investigative effort, witness accounts, and emerging forensic technology finally allowed authorities to formally connect Gary Ridgway to the Green River murders, bringing closure to one of the longest-running serial murder investigations in United States history, and marking a significant milestone in the application of DNA evidence in cold case prosecutions across law enforcement agencies' evolution. In 2003, Gary Ridgway entered into plea negotiations with prosecutors in the Green River case, seeking to avoid the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation with investigators. The agreement resulted in Ridgway pleading guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and agreeing to assist authorities in locating victims' remains. Prosecutors stated that accepting the plea deal was intended to provide answers to families of victims and to help investigators recover additional evidence. Ridgway provided detailed admissions, describing how he selected victims, carried out the murders, and attempted to avoid detection by moving remains and contaminating crime scenes. He admitted that his actions were intended to confuse law enforcement and delay the identification of his crimes over many years of investigation. He was formally sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with additional penalties for evidence tampering. The sentencing marked the final judicial outcome of the case after decades of investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. It also reflected the culmination of extensive plea discussions and forensic developments that had finally connected Ridgway to the full extent of the Green River murders. Through his cooperation, investigators were able to confirm additional details about victim selection patterns and the handling of remains. The case concluded with Ridgway serving life imprisonment in a secure correctional facility for his crimes. His plea agreement ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison, with no possibility of release or further appeal allowed under law at sentencing. After Gary Ridgway's sentencing, investigators continued recovering and identifying victims' remains using information he provided during cooperation with authorities. Additional remains were recovered in later years, and in 2023, Laurie Ann Raspotnik was identified through modern forensic techniques. Ridgway was transferred between correctional facilities multiple times as investigators continued efforts to locate additional victims and review cold cases. Law enforcement agencies kept reviewing missing person reports and cold case files believed to be connected to him across jurisdictions. Ridgway confessed to more murders than any other confirmed American serial killer, shaping his place in criminal history. His case demonstrated major advances in forensic science and continues to support ongoing efforts to identify remaining victims. Authorities emphasize that the investigation remains active in parts, as unidentified victims continue to be linked to Ridgway through evolving forensic methods, ensuring families may still receive answers and long-delayed closure in future ongoing investigations continue. On the 1st of April 1988, 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley, a second-grade student at Fairfield Elementary School in Fort Wayne, Indiana, disappeared while playing with two friends. She was also a member of the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church. On that Good Friday afternoon, the children were moving between houses when April returned alone to retrieve her umbrella. Around 3 p.m., she went missing. John Miller, who later admitted responsibility for the case, stated that he had planned to take a child but had not specifically targeted April before encountering her. According to later statements, he asked her to get into his vehicle and transported her to his trailer. Authorities later determined that April lost her life shortly afterward, Later that night, her remains were left in a rural ditch. Following April's disappearance, her mother reported her missing when she failed to return home for dinner. A large-scale search effort was launched involving approximately 250 Fort Wayne police officers and 50 volunteers. Witness testimony later described seeing a white male in his 30s guiding a girl believed to be April into a blue pickup truck. Another report placed a similar vehicle near the eventual recovery site. The disappearance marked the beginning of one of Indiana's most notable cold cases, as the child's case quickly escalated into a major investigation involving multiple agencies. This incident triggered an immediate response that intensified local awareness and made the case a major focus throughout the Fort Wayne region. On the 4th of April 1988, 3 days after April Tinsley's disappearance, a jogger discovered her remains in a ditch located just west of Spencerville, Indiana. Investigators arriving at the scene found additional physical evidence nearby, including one of April's shoes and other personal items inside a shopping bag. A medical examination later confirmed that April had died from criminal actions. Findings suggested she had been deceased for approximately 1 to 2 days before being discovered, and that her remains had likely been placed in the ditch only hours before discovery. In the immediate aftermath, the case drew significant public attention. On the 5th of April 1988, 2 local radio stations established a reward fund to encourage information, leading to identification of the person responsible. Additional funds were also created to assist with burial expenses and support the grieving family. April's memorial service was held on the 8th of April 1988 at Faith United Methodist Church, the same church where she participated in the children's choir. She was later buried at Green Lawn Memorial Park. The discovery confirmed the case as a major criminal investigation and intensified the urgency of efforts already underway across Fort Wayne and surrounding areas. Following the confirmation of April Tinsley's death, law enforcement continued an extensive investigation led by the Fort Wayne Police Department. Early in the inquiry, authorities focused on several leads, including a 3-4-year-old suspect who was charged in a separate child-related case. However, that individual was later acquitted and the investigation remained unresolved. The case quickly became a focal point for community action. On the 20th of April 1988, approximately 90 members of the Fort Wayne community formed a volunteer organization known as April, which stood for Associated Parents Regional Independent League, later also referred to as Abduction Prevention Reconnaissance and Information League. The group's purpose was to assist law enforcement in addressing missing children cases and raising awareness about child safety. Despite early efforts, the investigation did not produce a definitive suspect. Police released a composite sketch based on witness descriptions of the individual reportedly seen with a child near a blue pickup truck. Additionally, on the 26th of April 1988, DNA samples from April and 5 suspects were sent to a private laboratory in Maryland for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. During this early phase, the case remained open but stalled, with investigators relying heavily on public tips, witness accounts, and emerging forensic methods that were still in development at the time. Despite ongoing review, no additional suspects were confirmed, leaving the investigation active but without clear advancement. On the 21st of May 1990, investigators discovered a disturbing message on a barn in Street Joseph Township. The message referenced April Tinsley's murder, stating, "I killed 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley," and included a taunt asking if investigators had found the other shoe, along with a claim that the writer would kill again. The message was written using crayons found near the barn. Initially, law enforcement considered a possible connection between this message and other child murder cases, including the death of 7-year-old Sarah Jean Bowker in Fort Wayne. Due to similarities, authorities formed a joint homicide team in April 1991 to investigate both cases together. However, on the 7th of August 1991, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit concluded that while the cases shared similarities, they were not connected. During this period, the threatening message marked a significant development because it indicated that the perpetrator was still active, or at least communicating with law enforcement. It also introduced the possibility that the offender was monitoring media coverage and police efforts. Despite these developments, the investigation remained without a confirmed suspect. The barn message became one of the earliest known instances in which the killer directly referenced the crime, signaling a disturbing pattern that would continue years later. Despite extensive review of leads and continued attention from investigators, no confirmed suspect was identified at this stage, and the case remained open, with the barn message continuing to stand as a key early communication from the offender in the ongoing investigation at that time. After the early 1990s developments, the investigation into April Tinsley's murder continued without resolution for years. Law enforcement agencies maintained the case as active, with periodic reviews and renewed efforts to identify the perpetrator. In 2005, April's family held a press conference at the Allen County Courthouse, publicly appealing for new leads and information. Despite these efforts, the case remained cold. In 2009, Indiana authorities requested assistance from the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment (CARD) task force to help re-examine the investigation. Over time, additional profiling efforts were conducted. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit described the offender as a preferential child sex offender, indicating a long-term sexual interest in children. The profile suggested the suspect was a white male, likely in his 40s or 50s, and living or working in northeast Fort Wayne or Allen County, with low to medium income. Media coverage also played a role in keeping the case visible. The murder was featured on programs such as America's Most Wanted and later on Crime Watch Daily in 2016. These broadcasts aimed to generate public tips and renewed awareness. Despite continued investigative work, the case remained unsolved for decades, with only behavioral profiles and media appeals sustaining progress during this long period of uncertainty. Law enforcement continued periodic case reviews while maintaining active status, but no verified suspect emerged, leaving the investigation unresolved for years. Despite sustained investigative attention and public awareness efforts across multiple agencies involved. During Memorial Day weekend in 2004, investigators discovered 4 additional notes across the Fort Wayne area that were believed to be linked to April Tinsley's killer. 3 of the notes were placed on girls' bicycles, while another was found in a mailbox. 3 of the messages were sealed in plastic bags along with used condoms and Polaroid photographs of a man's lower body. One of the notes directly referenced April Tinsley, claiming the writer had been watching potential victims and threatening future violence if police reports were made public. The note also explicitly stated the writer was responsible for April's abduction, rape, and murder, and threatened to blow up a house if demands were not met. Crucially, DNA recovered from the condoms matched the existing DNA profile from the original investigation. This was the first strong forensic confirmation linking the 2004 threats to the original 1988 murder case. These discoveries marked a significant turning point as they demonstrated that the offender was still active years after the original crime and was leaving biological evidence behind. The connection between the 2004 materials and earlier DNA evidence strengthened the case, but still did not immediately identify a suspect. The findings helped renew investigative focus and eventually contributed to later forensic genealogy efforts that would prove decisive in resolving the case many years later. Authorities treated the forensic evidence linkage as a critical breakthrough, reinforcing the belief that the individual involved remained within reach of modern investigative techniques and could still be identified through advancing forensic methods and renewed case analysis efforts at that stage. In 2015, forensic advancements led investigators to use DNA-based composite sketching through Parabon nanolabs. An updated composite image was released in 2016 based on genetic information. Despite these efforts, the individual remained unidentified. In May 2018, a Fort Wayne Police Department detective submitted forensic evidence to Parabon nanolabs for genealogy analysis. The company used GED match to trace potential relatives of the unknown individual. This process significantly narrowed the pool of possible identities. By the 2nd of July 2018, genealogist C.C. Moore narrowed the investigation to 2 brothers, including 9-year-old John D. Miller of Grable, Indiana. Investigators further strengthened the case by collecting forensic evidence from items recovered from Miller's trash, which matched the original investigation records. On the 15th of July 2018, detectives visited Miller at his home and asked him to accompany them to the authorities' office. After being advised of his rights, Miller reportedly acknowledged the case by stating, "April Tinsley," before formal questioning began. During the subsequent interview, he provided a statement regarding his involvement in the disappearance and passing of April Tinsley. This breakthrough marked the end of a 30-year-long cold case investigation and led directly to formal legal proceedings. The identification of Miller confirmed the effectiveness of forensic genealogy in resolving long-standing unsolved cases and provided closure to an investigation that had remained active across multiple decades and investigative phases. Following his statement, John D. Miller faced legal proceedings related to the case. He initially denied responsibility in July 2018, but later accepted responsibility on the 7th of December 2018. On the 21st of December 2018, Miller received an 8-year sentence. After sentencing, he was placed in the Indiana Department of Correction Reception Diagnostic Center before being transferred to the Newcastle Correctional Facility in January 2019. His earliest possible release date was set for the 15th of July 2058. In April 2015, prior to the arrest, construction had begun on a memorial called April's Garden in Fort Wayne. After the case was resolved, the site became a central location for remembrance activities. In July 2018, a memorial walk was held, starting at April's Garden. In 2019, 9 investigators involved in resolving the case received national recognition from the National Association of Police Organizations for their decades-long effort. John Miller later passed away from natural causes on the 4th of September 2025, while still in a correctional facility. The case remains one of Indiana's most significant cold cases, resolved through forensic genealogy and long-term investigative persistence. His passing closed a final physical chapter in the case, but the investigative legacy continues to be cited as a major example of modern forensic breakthroughs used in resolving decades-old investigations across the United States justice system today. Cassie Jo Stoddart, born on the 21st of December 1989, was a 16-year-old high school junior at Pocatello High School in Idaho. On the night of the 22nd of September 2006, she was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, at their home in northeast Bannock County. The Contreras family was out of town, and Cassie had been hired to care for their pets during the weekend. Earlier that evening, Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham, visited her at the house around 6 p.m. Later, her classmates Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk arrived to hang out. The group spent time together, and Cassie gave them a tour of the house, including the basement. They then watched the film Kill Bill, Volume 2 Inches, the living room. Before the movie ended, Draper and Adamczyk left, stating they were going to the movie theater. Unknown to Cassie, Draper had already unlocked the basement door before leaving, allowing both boys to re-enter the home later without being noticed. These events marked the final normal interactions between Cassie and her classmates before the planned sequence of actions that would later follow in the case. At this stage, nothing unusual was apparent to Cassie as she spent time inside the residence with her peers, unaware of any hidden actions taken prior to the group leaving the house earlier in the evening. She remained focused on her responsibilities at the house, continuing the evening without awareness of the events that had already been set in motion there. Brian Lee Draper, born in Sandy, Utah, and Tori Michael Adamczyk, born and raised in Pocatello, Idaho, were the two teenagers at the center of this case. Their friendship began as sophomores at Pocatello High School, where they met and bonded over a shared interest in filmmaking and recording videos together. Both boys were classmates of Cassie Jo Stoddart in the 11th grade. Over time, their filmmaking shifted into documentary-style recordings, where they discussed violent fantasies and planned attacks. They were heavily influenced by the Scream horror film franchise and expressed admiration for fictional killers Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. They also showed a fixation on real-life mass killers Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold from the Columbine High School massacre. They referenced these individuals in homemade recordings and expressed a desire to replicate similar acts of violence. Their goal included gaining recognition and notoriety through violent acts, which shaped their developing ideology. This shared interest in film, violence, and notoriety gradually developed into a coordinated mindset that influenced their later decisions. This mindset eventually led them to identify potential victims, including Cassie Jo Stoddart and their classmate Matt Beckham. Their recordings and discussions consistently reflected an escalating focus on violence and imitation of high-profile crimes. Through these shared interests and recorded plans, investigators later understood how their friendship developed into a coordinated outlook that prioritized notoriety, ultimately leading them toward selecting victims within their own school environment and setting the stage for the events that followed next. Draper and Adamczyk escalated their violent intentions during the planning phase before the murder. According to background information, the two teenagers documented their plans in video recordings that included discussions of motives inspired by horror films and real-life mass shootings. They also created what they called a death list on the same day Cassie Jo Stoddart was killed, identifying potential victims, including Cassie and her classmate Matt Beckham. The pair acquired weapons prior to the attack through Joe Lucero, who testified that he purchased 4 knives using money contributed by both teenagers. One knife had a serrated blade, while the others were non-serrated, and Draper claimed ownership of the serrated knife according to testimony. They rehearsed and recorded discussions of violent scenarios referencing Columbine and Scream, and these recordings were later recovered and presented in court. This section establishes that the murder was not spontaneous, but involved prior planning, weapon acquisition, and structured decision-making, supported by recordings and testimony. The documented planning phase demonstrated how the teenagers moved from discussion to preparation through repeated recording sessions and coordinated actions that were later analyzed by investigators during the trial process. These materials included references to horror films and real-world mass shootings, which reinforced the prosecution's view of premeditation. They also showed how a death list and weapon acquisition were part of the same structured planning process, supported by witness testimony and recovered evidence from the investigation. This confirmed the case was fully premeditated and deliberate in nature. Draper and Adamczyk had already visited the Contreras residence earlier in the evening and secretly unlocked the basement door before leaving. Later, they returned to the neighborhood, parked nearby, and re-entered the home using the basement access. Once inside, they wore dark clothing gloves and white painted masks. They attempted to create noise inside the house, hoping to lure Cassie, Joe, Stoddart, and Matt Beckham downstairs. They also tampered with the circuit breaker, turning off the house lights to increase fear and confusion. When their initial attempts failed, they restored some lighting briefly. During this time, Cassie became uneasy due to unusual power fluctuations inside the house. Beckham noticed that one of the dogs was reacting anxiously, barking toward the basement stairs. Concerned Beckham contacted his mother, who offered for Cassie to leave with him. However, Cassie declined because she felt responsible for completing her house-sitting duties. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Beckham was picked up by his mother, leaving Cassie alone in the house. Shortly afterward, Beckham contacted Adamczyk by phone, but heard whispering and assumed the boys were at the movie theater. This section establishes the final moments before Cassie was left alone, unaware that the intruders were already inside the home. All events during this period occurred before any physical attack took place and form the final sequence of movements inside the residence prior to the crime. These actions and communications marked the closing stage of the evening timeline inside the Contreras home as documented evidence. Draper and Adamczyk waited after Beckham left and again turned off the house lights. Once they confirmed Cassie Jo Stoddart was alone, they moved from the basement to the upper level of the Contreras home. Draper carried a dagger-type weapon, while Adamczyk carried a hunting knife. The two entered the living room area and attempted to scare Cassie by opening and slamming a closet door. Cassie was resting on the couch at the time. After this attempt, they launched the attack and stabbed her multiple times. The total number of stab wounds was approximately 30, with 12 considered potentially fatal. Both knives were used during the assault. Most injuries were caused by the serrated blade, while the fatal wound to the heart was caused by the non-serrated blade. The attack was sudden and took place entirely inside the living room of the Contreras residence. After the stabbing, Cassie succumbed to her injuries at the scene. Her body remained inside the home and was later discovered 2 days afterward when her relatives returned from their trip. This section focuses strictly on the sequence of events during the attack and the injuries sustained as documented in the case information. All actions occurred in a brief time frame within the same room, with no additional locations involved during the incident, and investigators later reconstructed the sequence using recovered evidence, witness statements, and physical findings, consistent with the described events as established in official case documentation and court records reviewed by investigators. The investigation into Cassie Jo Stoddart's murder began with police focusing on individuals connected to the Contreras household. Early attention was directed toward the boyfriend of Cassie's mother's partner after his fingerprints were discovered on the basement circuit breaker door. This raised initial suspicion because the breaker had been tampered with during the incident. However, he was later cleared after explaining that he had previously performed electrical work at the residence, an explanation supported by the homeowners. Investigators then shifted focus to Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham, who was the last known person to see her alive. Beckham reported that the house lights had been flickering during his visit, a detail supported by his mother's statement to police. He also passed a polygraph examination and had a consistent alibi, which led investigators to eliminate him as a suspect. The inquiry then turned to Brian Draper and Toria Damsick. When questioned, they claimed they had gone to a movie theater to watch Pulse, but they were unable to describe details of the film. They later changed their account, stating they had been going through cars instead. These conflicting statements increased suspicion among investigators and prompted deeper interrogation. As inconsistencies mounted, police concentrated their efforts on Draper and Adamsick, narrowing the investigation from household connections to the two classmates who would ultimately become the primary focus of the case. Investigators continued collecting statements and comparing timelines to verify movements of all individuals involved during the night of the incident, while continuing analysis process. Draper and Adamsick were arrested on the 27th of September 2006 and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. During multiple interrogations, each teenager blamed the other for the crime. Draper initially admitted being present but denied stabbing Cassie. In later statements, he confessed to stabbing her, claiming Adamsick instructed him to ensure she was dead. Police were led to Black Rock Canyon, where the teenagers had burned and buried clothing, masks, and weapons used in the crime. Investigators recovered these items along with a partially burned VHS tape. After restoration, the tape revealed video recordings in which the teens discussed and planned the murder and other potential attacks. This evidence, combined with their conflicting statements and recovered materials, formed a critical part of the prosecution's case. The section highlights how both physical and digital evidence connected the suspects directly to the crime and their prior planning. Together, the interrogations, recovered evidence, and digital recordings allowed investigators to reconstruct the planning process and confirm the involvement of both teenagers in the crime. The conflicting versions of events given by Draper and Adamsick were directly contradicted by physical evidence recovered from Black Rock Canyon and by the restored videotape. This combination of testimony and forensic recovery strengthened the prosecution's case and linked both suspects to the preparation and execution of the murder. The evidence also demonstrated how the investigation moved from statements alone to material proof gathered from multiple locations and sources tied to the suspects during the investigation process. Draper was convicted of first-degree murder on the 17th of April 2007, while Adamsick was convicted on the 8th of June 2007. Both were sentenced on the 31st of August 2007 to life imprisonment without parole plus additional consecutive sentences for conspiracy to commit murder. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence of their admiration for the Columbine shooters and references to the Scream franchise. Draper's writings, including a passage titled Columbine, were presented in court, expressing obsession with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Both individuals remain incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution. Their appeals were repeatedly denied by state and federal courts over the following years. In addition, they were later called to testify in a separate 2024 murder trial, but did not provide testimony. After the crime, Cassie Jo Stoddart's funeral was held on the 1st of October 2006, attended by approximately 500 people. Her family also created a memorial initiative called Pumpkins for Cassie, supporting local charities in her honor. In 2010, her family filed a civil lawsuit against the school district, which was dismissed on grounds that the crime was not foreseeable. This section concludes the case timeline, covering legal outcomes and the lasting impact on the victim's family and community. The case remains a significant example of a premeditated, school-related homicide that deeply affected the local community and continues to be referenced in discussions about youth violence, criminal planning, and the influence of media on behavior within the limits of the documented court records and investigation findings. As established in official court proceedings records,